What if the person who knew you best, your own blood, decided you were worth less than nothing? What if their words cut deeper than any blade, severing every tie you ever believed existed? Tonight, we uncover the shattering truth behind a family's unraveling, a declaration that tore one's soul from its roots, forever changing their perception of belonging. The memory is a scar, perpetually fresh. It was late autumn, the air crisp with the promise of frost. But inside, the chill was bone-deep. He remembered the muted glow from the kitchen, the scent of stale coffee clinging to the walls, a silent witness to their final, brutal confrontation. His brother, usually a steadfast anchor, stood silhouetted against the weak light, his face a mask of stone. Every muscle in his jaw was taut, every line around his eyes etched with an unfamiliar, terrifying resolve. The quiet was suffocating, punctuated only by the frantic beat of his own heart. Then came the whisper, barely audible, yet resonating like a thunderclap in the sudden, cavernous silence, "Your dead's family." The words, delivered with a chilling finality, didn't just hit, they detonated. They shattered every shared memory, every whispered secret, every bond forged in childhood innocence. A cold dread, far more absolute than any physical pain, washed over him, threatening to drown him whole. What unpardonable sin could possibly justify such a profound, absolute exile from his own blood? The memory of that late autumn evening, stark and unforgiving, often overshadowed the years that preceded it. But the seeds of discord weren't sown in a single night. They were cultivated over seasons, watered by misunderstandings and neglect, long before the final words were spoken. An insidious quiet had begun to settle over the family home, replacing the boisterous laughter of their youth. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a hairline fracture in a sturdy foundation, easily dismissed until it became a chasm. There was a specific incident involving a forgotten inheritance, one that David, the older brother, had always felt was rightfully his alone, a feeling he never fully vocalized until much later. This unspoken grievance festered, a slow-burning ember beneath the surface of their seemingly placid lives. Mark, ever the peacemaker, often found himself mediating small arguments between David and their parents, disputes that grew increasingly sharp-edged. The family dynamic, once a harmonious symphony, began to sound discordant, each member playing a different tune. A particularly tense family dinner, where David abruptly left the table after a casual comment about his career choices, marked a significant shift. He began to withdraw, his once open nature replaced by a guarded silence, a wall slowly rising between him and the rest of them. What exactly triggered this sudden, profound change in his demeanor remained a mystery to Mark for years, a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. It wasn't just his silence, it was his actions. David, who had always been content with a modest life, suddenly became consumed by ambition, an almost frantic drive for success. He started taking on risky business ventures, pouring family savings into speculative projects without much consultation. Their parents, usually lenient, voiced their concerns, only to be met with David's icy There was a particularly disastrous investment in a startup that promised a revolutionary new energy source, a venture David championed fiercely despite obvious red flags. The financial strain it placed on them was immense, leaving a palpable tension whenever the topic of money arose, which was often. And then there was the secret loan he took out, using their mother's name, a debt only discovered months later. The discovery of the loan was a hammer blow, not just to their finances, but to the trust they shared. Mark recalled the tremor in their mother's voice as she recounted the bank's call, the disbelief in her eyes. David, cornered and defiant, had justified it as a necessary evil, a temporary measure for a guaranteed future success that never materialized. The family began to walk on eggshells around him, each conversation carefully navigated to avoid triggering an outburst. He grew increasingly critical of Mark, picking apart his choices, his relationships, even his appearance, with a venomous precision that felt entirely uncharacteristic. There was a strange glint in David's eyes during these attacks, a shadow of something deeper and more troubling, something that whispered of a hidden resentment cultivated over a lifetime. Mark tried to reach out to understand the source of his brother's bitterness, but every attempt was rebuffed with a coldness that stung. David's once frequent calls to their parents dwindled, replaced by curt, businesslike exchanges. He started skipping family gatherings, offering vague excuses about work commitments or sudden illness, absences that spoke volumes. The vibrant warmth of their holiday celebrations began to cool, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. Their father, a man of few words, grew noticeably quieter, his shoulders a little more stooped. It was whispered among distant relatives that David had fallen in with a new, less reputable circle of friends, a group whose influence seemed to darken his spirit. These new acquaintances, slick and ambitious, seemed to fuel David's escalating belief that he was inherently superior, destined for greatness that the rest of his family was too blind to see. He often spoke of leaving their small town, of shedding the mediocrity he felt clung to their name. His words, once just Shab, now carried an edge of contempt, especially when directed at Mark. One evening, after a particularly harsh critique of Mark's career as a teacher, David openly mocked his brother's simple aspirations, revealing a long-held disdain for Mark's path, a disdain Mark never knew existed. This wasn't merely a disagreement. It was a revelation of a festering wound David had carried for years. Silently, the family house, once a sanctuary, became a battleground of unspoken resentments and simmering anger. The air grew thick with tension whenever David visited his presence, a dark cloud blotting out the sun. Their mother, always the optimist, found her smiles fading, replaced by a permanent crease of worry between her brows. David's actions escalated from verbal jabs to deliberate slights. He began to purposefully exclude Mark from conversations, dismissing his opinions, or even walking away mid. There was a bizarre incident during a family vacation where David intentionally spread a false rumor about Mark to a distant aunt. A petty act that left Mark bewildered by its sheer malice. The malice was a new, unsettling characteristic, a shadow that clung to David and seemed to grow with each passing day. Mark tried to confront him about the rumor, only to be met with a blank stare and a chilling denial, as if David genuinely couldn't recall the event, or perhaps didn't care to. The family struggled to reconcile the David they knew with this cold, calculating stranger. Their parents, torn between their sons, found themselves increasingly caught in the crossfire, their pleas for unity falling on deaf ears. There was an old photo album, filled with childhood memories, that David deliberately lost after an argument about shared mementos. An act of erasure that felt profoundly symbolic. This deliberate erasure extended beyond mere objects. David systematically began to rewrite their shared history, minimizing Mark's achievements, exaggerating his own contributions, and even distorting past events to cast himself in a more favorable light. He would recount childhood anecdotes with an altered plot, making himself the hero and Mark the perpetual sidekick or even antagonist. These subtle manipulations chipped away at Mark's sense of reality, making him question his own memories. The parents, witnessing this quiet psychological warfare, grew increasingly distressed. But their attempts to intervene were always met with David's fierce resistance, a resistance that hinted at a deep-seated insecurity he vehemently refused to acknowledge. The tension in the house became so thick it was almost suffocating, an invisible pressure that weighed on everyone. Mark found himself retreating, avoiding David whenever possible. Though their paths inevitably crossed during family functions, each encounter felt like navigating a minefield. One wrong word capable of detonating an explosion of pent-up anger. Their mother started keeping a small diary, not for pleasant memories, but to document David's increasingly erratic and hostile behavior, a secret record she hoped she would never have to reveal. This silent testament to the unfolding tragedy lay hidden beneath her bed, a morbid chronicle of their family's slow demise. The diary was a silent scream, a testament to the fact that the parents themselves were growing increasingly afraid of David, though they rarely admitted it aloud. His mood swung wildly, from feigned charm to volcanic rage, leaving everyone on edge. He started making veiled threats, subtle warnings about consequences if his wishes weren't met, particularly regarding family finances. A long-standing family tradition, the annual summer trip to the lake house, was suddenly canceled by David, who claimed ownership due to an old, murky family agreement Mark had no recollection of. This wasn't merely a change of plans. It was a unilateral declaration of power, a blatant assertion of control over their shared heritage. Mark searched through old family papers, looking for any mention of such an agreement, but found nothing concrete, only vague references to future arrangements that never solidified. It was as if David was pulling facts from thin air, twisting history to suit his narrative. The family, bewildered and exhausted, simply capitulated, too weary to fight. This pattern of David's unchecked assertions and the family's quiet surrender became the new normal, each capitulation deepening the chasm between the brothers. There was a particular night when David, intoxicated, confessed to a friend that he felt Mark had always been their parents' favorite, a confession overheard by a distraught neighbor. but never directly shared with Mark. This simmering resentment, born from a perceived favoritism, explained much of David's hostility, yet it remained an unaddressed wound. The family became adept at avoiding the truth, at tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and unacknowledged pain. The once unbreakable bond between the brothers frayed, then snapped. Not with a bang, but with a series of quiet tears and growing silences. The stage was set meticulously and tragically for that final, brutal confrontation in the muted glow of the kitchen, for the words that would echo with chilling finality, forever severing the ties of blood and belonging. The full weight of what David had been planning, however, remained an unimaginable horror. The kitchen's fluorescent light had hummed, a cruel witness to the words that tore Mark's world apart. "You're no longer part of this family." David's voice had been flat, devoid of the usual drunken rage, which somehow made it worse. "You never truly were." The declaration, a venomous whisper, didn't just exile him, it rewrote his very history. Mark had stood there, frozen, the smell of stale coffee and betrayal clinging to the air. His mother's eyes, usually so warm, were cast dew, her silence a heavier blow than any shouts. His father had merely nodded, a single, weary gesture that sealed Mark's fate. Was it the truth David had twisted, or a truth they all secretly believed? He remembered the cool night air hitting his face as he stumbled out, his few packed belongings a meager shield against the sudden emptiness of the world. The keys to his old sedan felt alien in his trembling hand. He drove for hours, aimless, the city lights blurring into streaky watercolors of a life that no longer included him. He wondered if David had planned this for months, meticulously, like some dark architect. Where did a person go when their entire foundation had been yanked out from under them? The memory of his father's distant nod gnawed at him, a festering wound. What secret burden had his parents been carrying that allowed this cruelty? Days bled into weeks, weeks into a desolate month. Mark found himself in a cheap, anonymous motel room. The walls thin enough to hear other people's laughter, a stark contrast to his own suffocating silence. He got a job, menial labor that required little thought, allowing his mind to replay the scene, each word a fresh cut. He couldn't shake the image of his mother's averted gaze. Had she tried to intervene, even a little before that final moment? He suspected she hadn't, and that suspicion hurt more than anything. He started seeing the world differently, a place where even blood ties could dissolve with a single, chilling phrase. What would David gain from this total erasure? The pain wasn't a sharp stab. It was a dor constante, ashi, like an old injury that never quite healed. He'd wake in the dead of night, heart pounding, convinced he heard David's sneer or his mother's unspoken judgment. He stopped answering calls from unknown numbers, fearing it might be his parents, not with an apology, but with further justifications for his banishment. He often found himself staring at his reflection, searching for the boy he once was, the one who believed in an unbreakable family. That boy was gone, replaced by a ghost of himself. Was there truly a hidden reason, a secret failing of his own, that he had never recognized? He moved from the motel to a small, isolated apartment, a place where the quiet could be either a comfort or a torment. He tried to build a new routine, a new life, but every interaction felt superficial. He'd meet new people, smile, make small talk, but the core of him remained guarded, a fortress built around a gaping void. He felt like an imposter, carrying a past that he couldn't share, a wound too deep to explain. He often pondered David's precise motives beyond the drunken confession of perceived favoritism. What deep-seated belief had fueled such absolute cruelty, such an unshakable conviction of Mark's unworthiness? His brother's declaration echoed in his mind. "You never truly were," each word a hammer blow against his identity. It wasn't just about being disowned, it was about being told he had never belonged in the first place, that his entire existence within that family was a lie. The thought was he tried to remember moments, small gestures of affection, a shared laugh with his father, a comforting hand from his mother. But now, even those memories felt tainted, twisted by David's insidious narrative. Had his parents always secretly felt this way, or had David merely manipulated their weariness into compliance? Sleep became a battlefield, dreams filled with distorted faces and whispered accusations. He'd relive that kitchen scene, but each time the details shifted, the words growing sharper, the silence heavier. He started writing, not stories, but fragments of his pain, desperate attempts to capture the slippery nature of his greed. He wrote about the betrayal, the bewildering capitulation of his parents, the chilling finality of David's voice. Yet, he still couldn't articulate the asterisk. Why asterisk? What was the true nature of the family's quiet surrender that allowed David's unchecked assertions to become their reality? He started walking long, aimless treks through unfamiliar neighborhoods, hoping to outrun the ghosts. He watched other families, parents laughing with their children, siblings bickering playfully, and a profound ache would settle in his chest. He envied their normalcy, their uncomplicated bonds. He wondered if David ever thought about him, if any of them did. Did they feel even a flicker of remorse? Or was he truly erased from their collective memory, a phantom limb they no longer acknowledged? The idea that his family had become adept at avoiding the truth, tiptoeing around their own complicity, felt like a fresh wound. He found solace in mundane tasks, the repetitive motion of his work, the simple act of preparing a meal. These small anchors kept him from drifting completely. But the quiet moments, the ones between tasks, were dangerous. That's when the what-ifs crept in. The if only he had confronted David sooner, if only he had seen the resentment festering beneath the surface. Yet, he knew deep down the outcome would likely have been the same. The stage had been set, tragically, for that final confrontation. But what role had he unknowingly played in its meticulous, tragic crafting? One evening, he overheard a conversation in a coffee shop, a young man passionately defending his brother against an unjust accusation. A wave of nausea washed over Mark. The stark contrast to his own situation was crushing. He realized then the depth of his loss wasn't just a family, but the very idea of unconditional love, of steadfast loyalty. He had believed their bond was unbreakable. He now understood it had frayed, then snapped, not with a bang, but with quiet tears and growing silences. What was the exact moment the ties of blood and belonging had truly severed beyond that final kitchen scene? He sometimes imagined running into his parents, a chance encounter on a busy street. What would he say? Would he demand answers? Or would he simply walk past, a stranger among strangers? The thought of facing David, though, filled him with a cold dread. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his brother felt no regret, only a grim satisfaction. The full weight of what David had been planning, however, remained an unimaginable horror, a truth Mark hadn't yet dared to fully unpack. What other devastating secrets lay hidden beneath David's carefully constructed narrative of Mark's supposed failings? He carried the scars of his brother's harsh declaration everywhere, invisible but deeply etched. They informed his every decision, colored his every interaction. He learned to survive, to exist, but the joy, the lightness he once knew, seemed forever out of reach. He was adrift a vessel without an anchor, forever searching for a shore that might never appear. He knew he had to eventually confront the unresolved questions, not just about David, but about his own place in the world. But how could he face those truths when the very foundation of his past had been so brutally obliterated? And what new horrors might those answers reveal? David had always believed himself untouchable, a master manipulator whose careful machinations ensured his perpetual ascent. The world, he thought, was merely a stage for his brilliance, and Mark a convenient pawn in a larger game. A recent major business deal, the kind that cemented legacies, had just closed, swelling his accounts and his ego. He leaned back in his plush office chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, convinced that his reign was just beginning. But a whisper of doubt, a faint echo from a forgotten corner, had begun to stir in the periphery of his well-ordered world, a detail about the deal he dismissed as trivial. The first sign was almost imperceptible, a minor tremor disguised as a typical corporate headache. A crucial client, one whose loyalty David had taken for granted, expressed unexpected concerns about the new contract's terms. David brushed it off as standard negotiation, yet the client's tone held an unfamiliar chill, a guardedness he couldn't quite place. He instructed his team to smooth it over, confident that his charm, or perhaps a larger bonus, would easily quell the issue. What he didn't realize was that the concerns weren't about terms at all, but about a whispered rumor circulating through their industry, a story involving David's past dealings. The rumors, initially faint as a spider's thread, began to weave a more complex web. They spoke of questionable ethics, of promises made and swiftly broken, of an ambition that trampled over everyone in its path. David's name, once synonymous with ruthless success, now carried a subtle, unsettling undercurrent. Colleagues, usually quick with a back-patting compliment, now offered only curt nods in the hallways. He noticed the shift, a tightening in the atmosphere around him, a silent judgment that felt both unjust and oddly familiar. It was as if an old score-long thought settled and buried was suddenly being exhumed by unseen hands. Its decay spreading. Then came the tangible hit. The major deal, the one he'd celebrated, began to show cracks. The client, instead of resigning, threatened to pull out entirely, citing unforeseen liabilities tied to David's firm. Panic, a sensation David rarely allowed himself, flickered. His financial projections, once so robust, now looked fragile. He pored over spreadsheets, searching for an error, a miscalculation, refusing to believe his meticulous planning could be compromised. The source of these liabilities remained frustratingly vague, yet he couldn't shake the feeling it was personal, orchestrated by someone who knew his vulnerabilities intimately. His carefully constructed personal life also began to fray. Sarah, his long-term partner, usually a pillar of quiet support, grew distant. Her responses became clipped, her gaze often averted. He attributed it to stress from his work, assuming her patience was wearing thin, but a deeper unease settled within him. He tried to engage her, to explain his frustrations, only to be met with a cold silence that spoke volumes. One evening, he overheard her on the phone. Her voice hushed, mentioning secrets and a sense of betrayal that chilled him more than any business loss. Strange encounters began to punctuate his days. People from his distant past, faces he'd deliberately forgotten, seemed to appear at the periphery of his vision. A former associate from a failed startup, a venture where David had famously walked away with the lion's share, made eye contact in a coffee shop, a look of unsettling recognition in his eyes before turning away. David dismissed it as coincidence, yet the encounters felt too frequent, too pointed. It felt less like random chance and more like a carefully orchestrated sequence, a rising tide of ghosts he thought he'd long since buried. The legal team, usually his shield, grew uncharacteristically tense. Whispers of an inquiry started to circulate, initially vague and dismissed the standard regulatory checks. But then, a junior lawyer mentioned document requests concerning past project budgets, specifically the ones tied to the old, questionable deals. David scoffed at confident his paper trail was impeccable, but the lawyer's nervous glances suggested otherwise. He felt a cold dread, realizing that someone was meticulously digging through years of his carefully buried financial maneuvers. Searching for a single misstep, sleep became an elusive friend. His nights were plagued by fragmented images of Mark's accusing face, of old business partners he'd discarded, of the calculating smile he'd worn while orchestrating their downfalls. Paranoia, a feeling he'd always considered a weakness, started to creep into his waking hours. Every phone call, every unexpected email felt like a trap. He started reviewing his security systems, convinced someone was watching, waiting for him to slip. He couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed world was not just unraveling, but being actively dismantled piece by deliberate piece by an unseen hand. The sense of control, his most prized possession, began to erode. He'd balked orders at his assistants, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an irritable edge. His decisions, once sharp and precise, became clouded by suspicion and anxiety. A crucial presentation, meant to salvage the faltering deal, went disastrously. His confidence visibly shaken, his arguments lacking their usual persuasive power. The room watched him, not with admiration, but with a growing, unsettling pity. He realized, with a jolt, that the narrative he'd meticulously built around himself, the unstoppable genius, was starting to crack, revealing something far more vulnerable underneath. Then came the knock on the door, not from the police, but from a private investigator. The man was polite, almost too polite, and asked about discrepancies in a decade-old land acquisition. A project David had assumed was sealed shut. David dismissed him with disdain, but the investigator's parting words lingered. Some truths have a way of resurfacing, Mr. Thorne, especially when enough people start looking for them. He remembered the small, almost forgotten transaction, the one he thought he'd buried deep, involving a desperate old man and a signature that wasn't quite legitimate. Despite his best efforts to focus on the immediate threats, Mark's presence, or rather the void he'd created, began to loom larger. David found himself comparing his current predicament to Mark's past struggles, a bitter taste in his mouth. He'd always believed Mark weak, icily, broken. Now, David felt a strange mirroring, a growing sense of his own fragility. He saw Mark's face in the passing crowd, heard his name in overheard conversations. It was as if the universe, in its cruel irony, was forcing him to walk in the very shoes he'd forced his brother to wear, showing him the true cost of his carefully planned destruction. The final, unsettling piece of the puzzle arrived as an anonymous email. Sparse and to the point, it contained a single, chilling sentence. Ask about Project Chimera and the man called Elias. Project Chimera, David thought, a code name for a highly unethical, profitable venture from years ago, one only a handful of people knew about. And Elias, the name sent a cold shiver down his spine. Elias, the brilliant but morally flexible tech expert he'd discarded after the project, the one he thought he'd silenced for good. The email wasn't just a threat, it was a promise, hinting at a meticulously planned revenge, one that had been years in the making. David felt a cold dread as the words Project Chimera and Elias echoed in his mind, not like a distant memory, but a fresh, icy wind. He remembered the unholy alliance of dark money and cutting-edge bio, a venture so ethically dubious it made his stomach churn even now. Years later, what he hadn't known then was that Elias, the quiet genius, had been meticulously archiving every single detail, every whispered command, every shady transaction, not for profit, but for a meticulously planned, far more insidious purpose. This wasn't just a threat. It was an execution order on his carefully constructed empire, a slow, agonizing dismantling. The game had truly begun, and David, for the first time in his life, felt a prickle of genuine, unadulterated fear. What secrets had Elias truly kept, buried deep within those digital archives, waiting for this exact moment to surface? His meticulously built world, designed to crush others, now felt impossibly fragile. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it, but the unease gnawed at him. A physical ache in his chest. Was this how Mock had felt all those years ago? The thought was a bitter pill. His first instinct was to call his top legal team, but their lines were strangely busy, an anomaly that sent a fresh wave of panic through him. Then, a notification blinked on his private financial terminal, a small, almost imperceptible dip in one of his holding companies, an anomaly he couldn't immediately trace, like a drop of ink spreading in clear water. Someone was testing the waters, feeling for vulnerabilities, but the precision was unnerving. He'd always dismissed Elias as a grunt, a tool, never a mastermind capable of such intricate sabotage. He was tragically wrong. The ghost from his past wasn't just haunting him, it was actively dismantling his present piece by painful piece with surgical precision. He suddenly wondered if this entire network of attack was a product of years of patient cultivation, a spiderweb spun silently while he basked in his perceived invincibility. And was someone on the inside helping Elias? The next morning, an obscure tech blog, one he barely knew existed, published a speculative article about questionable ethical practices in biotech, mentioning several anonymous companies with uncanny parallels to his own ventures. No names, no direct accusations, but the subtext was loud and clear, a dog whistle to those in the know. It was a whisper campaign designed to erode trust, a tactic he himself had perfected against Mark years ago, now turned against him with devastating effect. The articles started multiplying, spreading like a virus through lesser-known forums and news aggregations, slowly building a narrative of corporate malfeasance, a chorus of digital disapproval. David felt the walls closing in, the insidious realization dawning that Elias wasn't after a payout. He was after something far more profound and destructive than money could buy, absolute annihilation of David's reputation and legacy. He scrambled, trying to identify the source, but the digital footprints were too faint, too fragmented, always leading to dead ends. It was like fighting smoke, an invisible enemy wielding 1,000 tiny knives. Then came the phone call, an encrypted number he didn't recognize. He answered, his voice tight. A distorted, synthesized voice, cold and devoid of emotion, spoke just 3 words. Project Chimera exposed. The line went dead. His heart hammered against his ribs. Exposed? How? And to whom? The implications were catastrophic. Project Chimera was the skeleton he'd kept most carefully locked away, a venture that bypassed every ethical boundary imaginable in pursuit of profit. If that became public, not only would his empire crumble, but criminal charges would be inevitable. He immediately ordered a full sweep of his internal systems, suspecting an inside job, but found nothing. The threat was external, or perhaps the mole was so deep, so sophisticated, they were undetectable by his own security protocols. The anonymous email had been just the first domino. Now the entire carefully constructed row was toppling. David paced his penthouse, the city lights below mocking his growing despair. His network of contacts, once impenetrable, now seemed porous. Their responses delayed, their voices hesitant. He tried to strong-arm a journalist he'd once compromised, only to be met with a polite refusal, followed by a pointed question about his own ethical history. The fear was no longer a prickle. It was a consuming inferno. Even his most loyal associates, the ones he'd paid handsomely for their silence and service, seemed to be subtly distancing themselves. A quiet exodus had begun, a slow draining of his human resources, leaving him increasingly isolated. It was as if a silent alarm had been sounded, warning everyone to abandon ship before it sank entirely. David found himself scrolling through old photos of Mark, a younger, more innocent Mark, a Mark he had systematically broken. A chill went down his spine. The mirroring was complete. He was living Mark's nightmare, the one he himself had orchestrated. Elias wasn't just punishing him, he was making him feel what Mark had felt. The slow suffocation, the public humiliation, the anonymous articles, once just whispers, now began to name names. His name directly linking him to Project Chimera, with irrefutable evidence. Documents, emails, voice recordings, all meticulously collected, all damning. The headlines screamed, the news channels blared, his face plastered across every screen, no longer the titan of industry, but a villain exposed. The stock market reacted violently, his company's shares plummeting faster than he could comprehend. He was losing billions, not over days, but hours. His lawyers, once eager to defend him, now advised him to prepare for the inevitable. Their faces grim. The legal battles ahead would be long, costly, and ultimately unwinnable. His past decisions, his callous disregard for others, had converged into a maelstrom of destruction, dragging him down into the very abyss he had dug for his brother. David stared out at the city, no longer seeing his kingdom, but the crumbling ruins of his self-inflicted downfall, the karmic debt finally due. The final blow came not from Elias, but from the authorities, an arrest warrant delivered by a solemn police chief. The charges were numerous, heinous, and fully substantiated by Elias's meticulous evidence. As the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, a wave of profound emptiness washed over him. Not anger, but a chilling realization. He had done this to himself. The destruction was complete, a monument to his own greed and cruelty, a stark, undeniable testament to the bitter fruit of his life's labor. Elias stood before the window of his modest apartment. The city lights a distant, shimmering tapestry. David was behind bars, his empire a scattered memory. The news channels, once dissecting market trends, now replayed the lurid details of his brother's fall. There was no joy, no fist-pumping triumph, only a profound, unsettling quiet. The vindication he had craved for so long tasted metallic, not sweet. He thought of their childhood, of David, not as the ruthless mogul, but as the protective older brother who taught him to ride a bike, who defended him against bullies. That David was lost long ago, consumed by an insatiable hunger for power. The man now imprisoned was a stranger, a consequence of choices Elias had tried, in vain, to avert. Forgiveness. The word echoed hollowly. Could one forgive the architect of their own suffering, even if that architect was family? Perhaps forgiveness wasn't about excusing the act, but about releasing oneself from the chains of hatred. He felt a loosening, not of love for David, but of the bitter resentment that had defined so much of his life. Karma had run its course, a relentless, impartial judge. David's downfall wasn't a victory for Elias, but a tragic, inevitable conclusion to a life lived without conscience. His gaze fell upon a faded photograph on his desk. A young David and Elias, arms around each other, beaming. The innocence in that image was a ghost. He picked it up, tracing the outline of his brother's smiling face. The cost of familial choices, he realized, was not only borne by the one who made them, but by everyone caught in their wake. Elias had survived, but the scars were permanent. He hadn't won, he had merely endured. The true victory, perhaps, was the peace found in letting go of the fight itself. The quietude that settled within him was not the roar of triumph, but the solemn whisper of a story finally, irrevocably told. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.